Welcome to the Happy in the Mess podcast. We are your hosts, Marlena, Sherry, and Matthew. We are therapists and coaches, and we want to share our own stories with you, as well as the wisdom, insights, and tips we've learned along the way. Thanks for tuning in to this episode.
All right. Well, welcome to this episode in Happy in the Mess. Today, we're going to discuss rejection sensitivity. What is it? How does it show up? How do you recover from it? And what makes it different than other types of maybe similar symptoms that people may experience, like social anxiety. So anyway, I'm here with our resident experts extraordinaire. We've got Matthew Morgan, the Misfit coach, and Sherry Timko, the relationship coach, who works with seasoned couples. How can people get a hold of you really quick so our listeners know if they need these particular expertise that you both offer?
I'm at MatthewEMorgan.com, or you can look up Misfit Refuge for the coaching. I'm working, hopefully getting a good flow going for that so that people can just kind of go there whether they want counseling or coaching. They can just follow the path.
Excellent.
Hi.
Thank you, Matthew.
I am Sherry Timko, and I'm at sherrytimko.com, and that's where you'll find all my stuff. And then, of course, you can find me on all the social media.
Excellent. And I'm Marlena. I'm your dating coach, and you can find me at coachmarlena.com. And this is a topic that I have seen show up a lot, both in coaching and clinically. And I'm so happy that we're going to talk about it today, because I think a lot of people suffer from this, but don't have the term for it. Like when I first heard the term, I was like, oh, that's what's happening. And a lot of my clients have also, when I've told them about this term, suddenly the light bulb goes off and they're like, realize that is probably something that they have. So let's first dive into what is this and how do we define it?
Yeah, rejection sensitivity. It's an emotional pain that stems from a failure or feeling rejected. It's something that's internal. It's not just like a random thing. One of my stories on this, because everything reminds me of a story, is in college I was doing telemarketing, and sorry for everybody that got a phone call interrupting dinner. It was my fault for 3 weeks, because I did this for 1 week and I hated it. I felt bad. It was emotional. People they'd swear at me, hang up, and threaten everybody. Like they were upset. Right. And I took it personally. They didn't know me from anybody else on the planet, but I took that so personally. After a week, I just emotionally couldn't handle it. Now I worked side by side with people who they get the little tally marks when people like swear at them. It's like, hey, I got 10 today, So it's the exact same set of experiences, but one of us experiences a lot more deeply with that.
A lot of distress, even if it wasn't personal, that kind of repeated sense of rejection really got to you.
Yeah, exactly.
So I would add a cognitive piece of it that it's almost like, even if we don't consciously keep track, there's a part of our brain that kind of tracks how often we're vulnerable and what kind of response we get to that. And so there's some sort of line, and it's very different from person to person. So I can't really define where that line is, but there's some sort of line that once you cross over that line and you've been vulnerable to a certain extent or a certain number of times, that it is very, very hard to step over that line again, unless something changes. You either gather up more strength or energy, or the other person reaches out to you, or something like in coaching, if one of us had a video that went viral or our podcast blew up, like something in the outside changes, and then you're willing to try again.
So once you've been burned or feel like you've been sort of rejected multiple times, it becomes harder and harder to step back out and have that emotional risk with others. I'm curious though, could you all describe to me what types of rejections do you see? Because I know it's not always just I asked someone out on a date and they said no. So what do you classify as a rejection?
In couples, I see this a lot. It really, to me, is an indicator that they could end up in a lot of trouble. It's just repeated rejections from the partner. And sometimes those are bids for attention, and where one partner is just trying to engage the other one, either in discussion or in an activity or some way of like, let's do something together. And the other partner is either checked out or distracted or thinks that that's not very important. But the other place that I really see that with couples is with sex, that a lot of times one partner will have a higher desire than the other. And so they will put out these bids for, some intimate interaction. And if the other partner constantly is saying, no, it's not a good time, I'm not into that, then eventually that high desire partner really stops asking.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Matthew, what do you see in rejection? Like, what are the types of rejection you witness?
It's interesting. Now, because I work with the neurodivergent community, ADHDers really have got a good handle on this. I mean, it's really a bread and butter problem that almost across the board, I hear this from people. And Sherry, I appreciate hearing that even from a couple standpoint, because my ADHDers in couples, they get all of that dumped on them. Where it is, it's everywhere. It's social interactions, it's work interactions. It's one of these things that's prevalent in so many areas, and exactly what Sherry was saying happens. Like eventually we quit making those bids for attention. We quit risking going out. It almost programs the brain just to believe that everything is unsafe. So we just kind of close ourselves up and say, forget it, I'm not coming out. But then we're also miserable inside because we just repeat that rejection over and over and over again because there's no counter agent to that story.
Matthew, do you see that same regeneration, that people are able to step back out into that space if something changes? Or do you see once they cross that line that really it's very, very hard for them to reprogram that?
It's very, very, very hard. And that's why therapy and even coaching, very much can be a coaching thing, because we can coach somebody through this. Speaking specifically to the ADHDers or the highly sensitives, which also I think have a similar structure in there, it takes a lot of cognition of knowing these things and trying to reprogram and realize what's going on. One of my examples, and I have cleaned my desk, unfortunately, because I always have things with me. But I usually have like a Lego minifigure here, and I'll hold this up to the camera so that the Lego minifigure in my head are roughly the same size. And I'll tell the clients, like, in our normal healthy brain, we recognize that these are two different things. My head is not the size of a Lego minifigure and vice versa. I have a very large head, as my football coach found out. But with rejection sensitivity, with the ADHD brain in general, and specifically to rejection sensitivity, the problem is we experience everything big, right? Everything is big. And so when everything is big, we don't want to go out. We don't want to change because we're frightened, because we're scared, because we've tried it before. So to answer the question, as we work, one of those things is letting people know that they have superpowers that can overcome this, or that these things aren't quite as major, but you have to constantly work and be really, really mindful as you go about doing this. And especially being careful that we don't repeat it, because as soon as it does, then we're right back in again.
It's interesting that that I also see this, Matthew, what you're sharing. I'm in the ADHD population I work with. Rejection sensitivity seems like a trait across the board, which is not in the DSM. It is not a listed quote unquote trait, but I see it so often. I almost feel like it ought to be listed there. And the memory of these moments of rejection is long lasting. I mean, I will have clients who will recall things that happened at 12 and 13 and even younger, where they felt rejected by a parent or someone else. And like, the story seems, yes, hurtful, but also as a clinician, I also am a coach. I'm like, it seems a little out of proportion to how big it seems today. Like your Lego thing was a great example. Like it seems like it's huge, although hearing the story as an objective outsider, like it doesn't, and of course I don't want to downplay how someone feels, but it is helpful to have some perspective. And is that enough though? So I kind of want to move into how do you treat this? How can this be healed?
Yeah, a lot of cognitive therapy, a lot of behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, I have found is a super great modality because it helps slow us down and get us out of that body reaction, right? That initial where we just go into really a defense mode. I love that you use that example. The first thing that jumped to mind as an ADHDer myself, I have fair collection of stories of every mistake that I've made. And the one that I will still go back to is ninth grade. We were writing, of all words, this is not a suggestion, it's just the word that I used. It was supposed to be assassinate. And I left out 3 letters, and so it became assassinate. And this is an advanced English class, right? Do I know now that the closer you get to a board, the more likely you are to make a mistake spelling because you're trying to do other things and talk at the same time? Absolutely. I know all that now, but I will still go back to that moment. I know this is a chalkboard, if that gives you my age, right? I know it was a chalkboard. It was on the side of the room. I can tell you where my desk was because that's where second place that I wanted to be. The first one was somewhere out in the hallway as everybody's laughing. So what do we do to fix that? Like, number one is recognizing that nobody in my adult career has asked me to spell that word again, nor have they held that over my head. I was able to get a master's degree and nobody was like, hey, you misspelled this thing, right?
In the ninth
So
grade.
it's learning to take that exhale, relax our bodies, recognize that this thing that seems very big to me is not very big. And it's that, again, that constant repetition is constantly pushing it in there, being mindful of it. And all that stuff kind of packages together. And I don't want to monopolize things too much, but I think the other part of that is having positivity, right? We want to build self-esteem, that my identity is not in spelling words right on the board. My identity is in doing what I do. It's who I am, and the more I can offset, it doesn't get rid of that, but it pads it. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, that's really, like, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't that big of a deal, but it takes that targeted building of honest self-esteem, not just I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me.
Yeah. I appreciate all of that, Matthew, taking that exhale, getting some perspective, breathing, realizing it's not that big a deal. And Sherry, what about you and working with couples? How do you heal and get over this?
A lot of the things that Matthew talked about very much apply here. The main reason that couples feel this rejection sensitivity is because it feels unsafe. So if you want to heal this in your relationship, one of the major pieces is to make that more safe. And sometimes that's about just being more aware of the other person and how they're trying to get your attention. And even if you don't catch those times when they're trying to get your attention, if you intentionally give them your attention when it's convenient, then that fills some of that. It balances it out. The other thing, and Matthew referenced this, John Gottman talks about positive sentiment and negative sentiment override. And that has to do with how you hear your partner. When you're in negative sentiment override, you hear what they're saying as more negative than what they mean. So your partner could say, how was your day? And if you're in negative sentiment override, you might think that they're judging you or asking you to account for your time, that there's some negative meaning behind that. So part of the work is, and if you're in negative sentiment override, you have to intentionally try to get out of that. So in therapy, in coaching, we try to increase those positive interactions so that it balances it out. So you can at least get into that neutral space or positive space. of positive sentiment override.
Well, this really speaks to how perception really can color our feelings and how everything. I mean, perception is almost everything. It almost trumps quote unquote reality, that way you perceive what's happening. Because rejection sensitivity is both real and perceived.
It really is.
Yeah.
The-
And go ahead, Matthew.
I would say I'll refer to that sometimes as the Ghostbusters phenomenon, where what we think becomes our destructor, or it can also become a healer if we can get ourselves in that right mindset. Sherry, I think it was Dr. Gottman that was it a 5-to-1 ratio, if I remember correctly, for positive to negative?
Yeah. His research found that you need a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative to have a truly great relationship. And I always joke with my clients because 5-to-1 sounds like a lot. And so I often will say, if you're just looking for an okay relationship, you're probably still looking for a 3-to-1 ratio. So definitely being in that more positive interaction to negative interactions. And so that perception comes in that a lot of times we reach out to our partner with a positive intention, even if it comes out sharp, even if it comes out sarcastic. And so being able to see beyond that and know that your partner was distracted when they said that, and that's why they maybe said it differently than they meant it, that's where that perception really shifts things. So many couples get into arguments about tone. Tone does not always reflect what your partner meant. A lot of times it means that they were halfway through a thought and shared that, or they were distracted by something else, or they had frustration somewhere else in their day. So that perception is a big piece of it.
I really like that little acronym that I learned a long time ago, Q-tip, which stands for quit taking it personally. So much of other people's reactions towards us don't have anything to do with us, or we interpret or ascribe meaning with negative meaning when there wasn't any. So I'm curious. So go ahead, Cherry.
This is such an interesting question, because what would happen? We have such a negativity bias in our brain.
Yeah.
But what would happen if you went through your day and you looked for a positive intention from everyone that you interacted with? If you just gave them the benefit of the doubt, or you just assumed that they meant something positive by it, that would shift the way that whole day would go.
Don Miguel Ruiz, if you've ever read The Four Agreements, is one of those. I'll give it almost a book status. It's a very, very thin book. It's a very quick read, and you can glean a lot through there. But his 4 agreements: be impeccable with your word, don't take anything personally, don't make assumptions, and always do your best. And it's like, as I read that, they're so simple, but man, if we could get a hold of that, like this rejection sensitivity would quiet down. If more people kind of practice just those 4 basics, I think.
I really like that. Thank you for that reminder of that great author. I'm curious, so we know that rejection sensitivity feels like intense, emotional pain and rejection on the inside. What does it look like on the outside? How do we know someone might be experiencing this when it may not be a readily apparent?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, go ahead, Matthew.
Sorry. Again, I'm going to deal with the neurodivergence, the classic ADHD things of, we're hiding. We're not going to start projects, right? Anytime somebody says procrastination, I love it. I'm like, oh, bring it on. No, I just procrastinate because I'm ADHD. I was like, no, you procrastinate because you're avoiding uncomfortable emotions. So what are we avoiding? Right. And so many, it's this fear. Vice versa. I also see people pleasers. People are like, oh, whatever it takes to make you happy, I'm going to do that, but they lose themselves in it. So I think those are 2 of the biggest ones that I see. Sherry, are there ones that you see within couples too? Or?
Within couples, I mostly see shutdown, that they just stop asking for that attention. Maybe this isn't across the board, but I think that if a wife stops complaining about something or stops asking for something, that a husband should get very concerned, because her not asking is not that she's decided she doesn't need it. It's she's decided that you can't give it to her.
Ouch. What about vice versa? Does that not work in the opposite?
It
It
does.
probably does. It's just not what I see typically. So yes, these
Yeah.
things almost always work in reverse as well.
Okay, so both men and women in a couple, or I mean, in straight couples. I'm sure it also shows up in other couples. So
The other
they shut down.
Yeah, well, I think the other way that you see it too, and maybe this is that difference, is I do see men who they tend to shut down, but I think conversely, I see probably at least an equal number, if not more, the anger, throwing out sarcastic comments, barbs, little quips in there, and it's never about, not never. I don't like using never. Usually, it's not about whatever they're angry about. It's coming out because that's the steam valve for this rejection sensitivity that's gone on, and they're frustrated. I don't know if it's not having intimate time or things like that. So now I'm ticked off at the dishwasher, So sometimes it takes a little bit of that skilled translator to get through to the core message.
Thank you for bringing in that male perspective. I work in this realm where I have to really see each person's perspective, but it is just a little bit easier to remember the female perspective, because that's what I identify with.
Yeah, not that I've ever done that, but I've heard rumors of guys who will do this. Hopefully my wife's not listening to this one.
Yeah, no, it's so true. Anger and irritability, as well as excessive people pleasing and or just shutting down and not asking anymore, and hiding. I hear a lot of shame in that goes on with rejection sensitivity. Shame is sort of the emotion that happens.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, how does this differ? Well, really quick, I just want to remind our listeners to like, share, and subscribe, or rate and review if you're listening outside of YouTube. We really appreciate any comments you have. If this is resonating, please let us know. And any other topics that you'd like to discuss, as we all share expertise in a variety of areas. So
and that way we don't feel rejected, right? That way we're not going to be.
Prevent our rejection sensitivity.
That's right.
by like, sharing, subscribing, and giving us good reviews. Yes, please. I'm curious, how does this differ from, how do we know that this is rejection? How do we know that it's not just social anxiety? We're hiding and not approaching our partners or social situations. How do we know it's not dysphoria? Like, what is the difference between social anxiety, rejection sensitivity, and general dysphoria?
I think what you've described is almost a bullseye here. I think social anxiety is the big encompassing part. And a lot of us have social anxiety. We get nervous about going out. We get the fear of public speaking is one of the top ones. I know I failed speech class in high school, and I always said I would never do a job that I had to talk in front of people.
Ironic.
Didn't stick with that one, obviously. But it took a lot to get there, right? And that's that social anxiety piece. But I think that the rejection sensitivity is something within that's even more specific, right? I'm not just nervous about being out. Now I'm nervous about people not liking me, not liking what I put out there, not being good enough, those internal mechanisms. So now my alarm bells are starting to go off, and I'm seeing those core anxiety symptoms of the get higher in the breath, the facial tension, the shoulders and the ears meet, and like that anxiety really starts to show up, which of course then makes it even harder to keep a calm brain and work on stuff. The dysphoria, I think, is a narrow subset of all of that, because it's rooted in, to me, it's been a lot of times that biological component of ADHD, that inability to filter senses, that inability to process how big something is, prominence. So that's even more narrow part, and then that's probably one of the hardest ones to treat, because now you've got to go back out through all the other circles too.
Gotcha. So it's kind of layered almost. It can be you can have all three, but you don't necessarily have to have all three to experience one of these.
I think I'm going to add an outside ring to your bullseye, because I think when couples get together, they don't imagine that their partner would ever reject them at the level that couples can get into. Even healthy couples, even couples who have really strong relationships, have sometimes when their partner is not available or says no, or, so there's even in that outer, so that outer ring is coming into the relationship with an expectation of how much time and attention your partner is really going to give you. And that over time, those no's or those times when you're ignored move you closer in on that bullseye so that you get into that rejection sensitivity. Now, can it go all the way in? Probably. I'd have to think a little bit more about that. But certainly, I think people come into relationships without expecting that their partner is not going to be available to them.
Yeah, and I also hear in this too, I mean, I'm sorry if I misunderstood you earlier, Matthew, about using your bullseye analogy, but I'm also wondering for both of you, could there be just rejection sensitivity in certain circumstances, but it doesn't show up elsewhere?
I think so. I mean, I would have to kind of maybe ponder that one, but I think it definitely it can show up in a particular area if we have that lack of esteem, that lack of support in that particular area. I think that's, Sherry might be interested to see with couples, especially those who come from families that did not model healthy relationships, how that, I mean, that might show up and get people on that track pretty quickly, I would think.
So I'm going to answer yes and no. It can just be isolated, can just be a part of the relationship or a part of your life. The problem is that over time, if you don't replenish whatever that is that lets you be vulnerable again, then you get exhausted. And then that bleeds over into lots of other areas of the relationship and your interactions with the world. So it has something more to do with resources and replenishing than necessarily that particular area or bleed over.
Mm. Well, I've also used EMDR to help people recover from rejection, and that has been really helpful. But I'm curious if it's one of those long-lasting things that you keep repeating. I'm kind of curious. Do you all know, does EMDR or other type of therapeutic modalities work for
And
this?
so with couples, the strongest way to get over this is to stop doing the thing that your partner is getting hurt by. And the further in the past that pattern falls, the less hurtful it is and the less you're looking for that rejection. So, in couples, a lot of times I'm like, hey, can you pay attention to your partner? Or can you ask for that attention in a different way? Because what happens with couples is they get to the point where they start making bids for attention and they're more like whispers. Like it takes so much vulnerability to ask for what you want that they just get to the point where it's like they crack that door open and they're like whispering next to the door saying, hey, can I have this thing that's really important to me? So changing how you ask for things often is part of the shift.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it does share what you were saying too. Individually, I think it applies as well, as we have greater life experience, as we start building further things into this, it can get better. I know for me, one of the big shifts was, now that I'm in my 40s, there's suddenly not a big concern about what people think of me everywhere, and I'm not trying to win the popularity contest that I felt earlier. And so as that part falls off, the rest of the stuff has more support. And there's a sense of just, this is me, this is who I am, and I can be okay with this. So it's a healing. There's definitely a scar there. There's definitely a feeling of we've come through this. But the more we work actively at healing it and not re-triggering and re-traumatizing, I think there is hope to get better through it.
Yeah.
Marlena, we haven't heard you talk much about people when they're dating and how rejection sensitivity impacts them. I think that would be really helpful. to hear.
Yeah, I see it a lot with singles who just sometimes in the neurodivergent population and sometimes not, where they've just had too many experiences where they feel like they've been rejected. And so it becomes harder to get back out and date again. And it becomes harder to, especially in the online dating space, there's just plenty of ghosting that goes on, where someone you're talking to just simply disappears without any explanation. And that happens in real life relationships too, which is actually more hurtful. And so people almost give up trying. And yeah, it's a thing. I feel like, and it may not always show up. It's interesting because I see a lot of women in particular, but men too, who have really full social lives, which is why I was thinking that you can have it in certain areas, but not in others. And they can go out and do things with friends, and that's really wonderful. But when it comes to the love life, it's just so much harder and so much riskier. And they can have vibrant, full friendships, but romantic relationships feel like too much of a risk. And so that just takes time and work and having, hopefully gathering evidence that suggests that it's not always going to be this hard or this rejecting, because honestly, at the end of the day, most people are lonely and want to connect. And part of its approach, like how you go about doing that to draw in people who will respond well to your bids for attention and affection, having the right mindset going into it and realizing that, again, it's not personal necessarily when someone rejects you, and it doesn't mean that everybody will. So it just takes time, as Matthew said, and it takes some outside perspective. And if it's been really stingy, like I've had some who have really stinging ex relationships or what have you, that where they felt rejection, that EMDR has worked very well to get over that hump. So yeah, those are the things I would say in my population that I work with.
Thank you for bringing in that perspective. That also reminds me that a lot of these things also apply when you're talking about friendships, like putting yourself out there and being vulnerable and having people not respond to that, or even respond to it for a while and then stop. Like there's a lot of those dynamics there as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard to make friends as an adult too. It's not only hard to date, it's hard to make friends. And unfortunately, there's this negative feedback loop that happens. Like once you've been rejected, then you're more likely to isolate and not go out, and then you become more suspicious of people and their motives. And then it just feeds into itself, and the loneliness gets deeper and the rejection sensitivity gets worse. And I'm sure a lot of people experienced that during the pandemic too. And yeah, so I just want everyone to know you're not alone and that there's a way to get out of this. Go ahead, Matthew.
And on that note, I wanted to wax a little seriously here real quick, if it's okay, because I think that's in its most severe form, that this rejection sensitivity really starts to turn inward. And a lot of people, this I think is where self-harm, harming others, this is where in its most severe form, not that everybody gets there, but it's where it opens the door most to that. We talked about the shutdown effect of it. And I always say there's always that worry if somebody gets to that point, if you feel like there's no hope, there's no way to come in, everything shuts down. It's has that strong propensity. And if I don't know why I'm feeling like this way, and we don't normally do this, but if somebody is there, if one of our listeners is there and feeling like there's no hope and nothing else is there, make sure you're reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, local crisis lines, 911 in most localities will be there. I know our Metropolitan Police actually has a mental health, an entire mental health unit that's trained for things like this, which I think is a phenomenal bonus in this time. So not to get too serious, but I think if anybody finds that they're in this rejection sensitivity or knows somebody who is in that shutdown point, make sure you're checking in on them and know that they're okay, and help with them, get them back to new steps here.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing those resources. Well, on that note, are there any takeaways you'd like our listeners, other than what you just shared, Matthew, that you'd like people to walk away with from this episode on rejection sensitivity?
Well, I guess I just want to encourage people to look for the good in their partner and to be open to doing things differently. That's really where you get out of rejection sensitivity with couples, is you do something different.
Thank you.
I think likewise, if you compare, I love the 5-to-1 Gottman ratio, but internally we can't always do that. That is the gold standard. But even if we can do a 1-to-1, like when you feel like having these negative thoughts, try to find one positive thing. And we're not replacing it. We're giving, because I'm a big fan of owning the emotion. So yeah, upset that we misspelled this word on the board, but you know what? We're also okay. We do these other things well, and that's all right. And if you can get in that habit of even just pairing those, a lot of times it prevents that negative spiral.
Mm. And I would say too, what I learned today is like your perspective may not always be accurate. So, checking in with a friend who might have a different perspective can be so helpful for that check. Anyway, like I said, like, share, and subscribe, rate and review if you like this episode, and let us know if you resonate. We love to hear from our listeners, and we will see you next week for our next episode to be announced. Thank you all.